Hello everyone, my name is Annie Wintos, and today I will be presenting to you on the Russian Federation in comparison to the US. First, a little bit of overview. We are going to go over the geography of Russia, the background and timeline, social development of Russia in comparison to the US, and then we're going to go over human rights, as well as gender inequality and human trafficking. And then finally, we're going to end with the state of social work in Russia and the US. Alright, so globally, this is where Russia is positioned on the map. A closer look at Russia. The Russian landscape has vast diversity, and there are more than 160 different ethnic groups of people who make their home in the country. However, ethnic Russians account for 4/5 of the population, but there are over 100 different languages, and as I said, many different ethnic groups, the largest being the Tatars, Ukrainians, Chuvash, Chechens, Bashkir, and Armenians. Alright, so a brief timeline of Russia. In 862 AD was the founding of Rus, and which was kind of like the beginning of Russia. And there were subsequently many Mongol invasions and invasions from neighboring territories during this time. In 1613 began the Romanov dynasty, otherwise known as Imperial Russia, and that followed for 3 centuries, including big names such as Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Alexander II. In 1867, Alexander II sells Alaska and the Aleutian Islands to the United States. So then in 1917, it is the end of Imperial Russia with the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution led by Lenin, who was a precursor to the Communist Party of Russia, and also the rise of the Soviet Union. In 1929, Stalin becomes dictator and initiates the Great Purge, which kills 20 million people. 1947 to 1991 was the Cold War, in which the United States and Russia were in a stalemate against each other, and they participated in space race and nuclear arms race. 1985 were the Gorbachev reforms, including perestroika, which means restructuring the Russian economy, and glasnost, which means greater openness. In 1986, Chernobyl happened, which was the world's worst nuclear accident. In 1991, Yeltsin was elected and urged democracy, and an unsuccessful communist coup makes for the fall of the Soviet Union and subsequently the creation of the Russian Federation. In 2000, President Putin was elected, and he is still currently, in 2019, the president of Russia. Alright, so a really basic timeline of the US, just to put it in perspective when we're comparing the two countries, Russia and the US. So before European colonization, the indigenous people of the Americas were here. 1492 was European colonization. 1776 was the U.S. independence from the British. 1861 to 65 was the Civil War. And finally, 1960s to 70s was the Vietnam War and civil rights. So the U.S. has a much shorter timeline than Russia. All right, so this is a social development profile comparing the populations. I just want to take a few minutes to read over some of the indicators. This is a poverty profile comparing Russia and the US. This is an economic profile comparing Russia and the US. All right, so what do these numbers mean? So the US is twice as large in population as Russia, and both countries spend a large amount of their GDP on military. The US has the highest debt in the world, while Russia is the 21st highest. After the breakup of the USSR, Russia became a hub for migration. Competition during the Cold War produced high investments in health, education, scientific research, and military through the communist government for Russia, and the US became a high spending and low savings country. All right, so social welfare in Russia. Welfare originated from the Soviet communist system and was shaped by the shift to the market economy after the fall of the Soviet Union. However, President Putin has utilized social policy to bolster regime support by fulfilling promises that appease key electoral groups, for instance the elderly, but that do not necessarily increase the general welfare of average Russians. For instance, Putin has raised pensions before every election since 1996 to gain support and hasn't raised the low retirement age of 55 and 60 for women and men. However, more in-depth improvements in healthcare and education have been promised and have failed to be met. The Soviet Union contributed to advances in healthcare, but increase in mortality. There was an increase in mortality after the Soviet Union broke up, and there was an immediate decline in health, with the highest death rate of the 20th century in the region during the 1990s. This high death rate was due to high rates of infectious diseases, cancer, heart disease, and tuberculosis. Currently, alcoholism, particularly for men, takes center stage as a public health crisis in Russia, with 1/3 of men and 1/6 of women struggling with alcoholism. So this is a comparison of social welfare between the US and Russia. If you want to take a few minutes to look at this. These numbers are rough numbers based on single-person households, and the money is per month. Also, I gave estimates based on a flat rate, so not income-based. Russia had a lot more flat rate benefits, not based on income, which we might see as like a leftover from the communist system. All right, human rights in Russia. During the Soviet Union, when Russia was part of the Soviet Union signed many treaties regarding human rights, but it hasn't seemed to be as much of a priority, if at all a priority, since the fall of the Soviet Union. So in 1987, the Convention Against Torture was ratified. In 1973, the International Covenant on Civil Rights was ratified. In 1973, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights was ratified. In 1981, CEDAW, or the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, was ratified. 1990, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was ratified. And then one of the only conventions that was ratified in post-Soviet Union fall was the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2012. Human rights violations. In 2013, Russia created the Gay Propaganda Law, which makes showing non-traditional sexual relationships illegal when shown to minors. This obviously is a huge problem and impedes LGBTQ rights. In 2017, the government decriminalized domestic abuse, which increased violence towards women and LGBTQ people in Russia. Russia also has a reputation of harsh suppression of free expression, and journalists' lives are endangered depending on what they are covering. There is an invasion of public privacy by the government, as well as censoring of the internet by the government while banning online anonymity. As of 2015, state-owned and controlled media owned more than 60% of news in Russia, with oligarchs with connections to government owning most of the media outlets. In addition, human rights violations occur with the occupation of Ukraine in the Crimean Peninsula. Within the Russian Federation, there are restrictions on associations with things labeled as undesirable foreign organizations or foreign agents. This in turn affects NGOs' abilities to work in Russia, as well as labeling mass media outlets as foreign agents causes issues. Finally, criminal justice in Russia, similar to the US, is complete with unfair trials and poor prison conditions. So, Moscow is a current hub for international human trafficking for sex and labor. During the Soviet Union, there was a safety net and guaranteed employment, although in some cases low paid, so prostitution was not really existent. The collapse of the SU and the transition to a market economy changed a lot of this, and the result is trafficking and prostitution. Current lack of legislation makes it very hard to prosecute traffickers. Victims of sex trafficking in Russia are mostly from Africa, but also come from surrounding Eastern European countries and Central Asian countries. So, gender equity in Russia. On the Gender Inequality Index, Russia has a value of 0.257, ranking it 53rd out of 160 countries in the world as of the 2017 index. In comparison, the US has a Gender Inequality Index of 0.189, which ranks it a little higher than Russia at 41st out of 160 countries. In Russia, 16.1% of parliamentary seats are held by women, and 95.8% of adult women have reached at least a secondary level of education, compared to 95.3% of males. So Russian women are more successful at completing education than men. Russia scores very high in GDI, except for when it is low for both genders. The Soviet Union made strides to integrate women in the workforce and provide support such as childcare, as it saw building emancipation of women as the key part of building the economy. Education was free and available during the Soviet Union, so many women were and still are highly educated and represented in sciences and medicine. After the fall of the Soviet Union, and currently with Putin and the Make Russia Great Again stance, it has erased LGBTQ rights and asserted an idea of masculinity as a response to values of the West. Alright, so social work in Russia. Post-communist societies such as Russia focus on new borders and exclusions, introduction of the market principle in economic and social systems, drastic withdrawal of safety nets from communism to capitalism, shock therapy, otherwise known as shock therapy, which is the introduction to market principle. Social work is involved in restoring these imbalances. Social work was not a field before this, before the fall of the Soviet Union. People saw the needs of social work being met by the government in communism. It's now a need. Huge migration to Moscow after the Soviet Union broke up is a need for social work. And finally, the East European Sub-Regional Association of the Schools of Social Work is a hub that brings together the practices in the area. So, the East European Sub-Regional Association of the Schools of Social Work, compared with the U.S. CSWE, see that the East European social work discipline has a lot more focus on almost social activism and holding the larger system accountable, which I found interesting. Alright, thank you guys so much for listening to my presentation.